This is from the British Library. And the answer to our question of Matthew 23 can actually be found in this manuscript in the bottom 5 lines there, which is the section from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 3. And when we read that in the Hebrew, we'll get a completely new understanding. Everything that we're seeing now, these contradictions. Matthew 15, don't obey the Pharisees. Matthew 23, do obey the Pharisees. Right now we're struggling with this contradiction. When we read it in the Hebrew, everything will fall into place and we'll have a much clearer understanding. Everything will make sense. Now, I want to give you some advice because I know this is a very long session, but this is stuff that you won't learn anywhere else, and this is really foundational stuff. What we're presenting here today is the tip of the iceberg. You don't even know the iceberg exists yet. We're just establishing the foundation to, really these are foundational things. And here's the book that I wrote on this. It's called The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And as you may have guessed, the reason I've called it that is that the way Yeshua's words are presented in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is fundamentally different from the way they're portrayed in the Greek version. And that's why I call it The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And I highly recommend this book because this is really foundational stuff. And there's a lot more that I'm not even going to be able to present here today. So really I recommend you get this book and read it a few times. Give it to your friends and to your rabbis and your pastors so they can also share on, especially your rabbis and pastors, so they can share on this very important topic, which really I lay some of the really foundations which in future years you'll see that amazing things are going to be revealed from this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Now let me again give you a piece of advice because this is a very long study and I've just completed the first half of the study. Michael's going to come up and say some very important words, so don't run away yet. But when Michael's done, we're going to have a short break and then I'm going to come back and do the second half. Now the second half is really we're getting deep into this Hebrew Matthew, and it's really, in a way, the most important part. So my advice is, if you can only come to one half of this study, come to the second half. So in Matthew chapter 23, we've seen that Yeshua says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They have this Mosaic authority. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. And here it really sounds like Yeshua is saying very clearly, you must obey the Pharisees. They sit in the seat of Moses. You must obey whatever they command you to do if you're going to be obedient to what Yeshua says. Well, we've already seen this doesn't really make sense. Matthew 15, Yeshua warns his disciples not to do according to the ways of the Pharisees. Their traditions of the elders transgress the Torah. However, in Matthew 23, saying obey whatever they tell you to do. If they tell you to put your right shoe on first in the morning, you better obey them because they have Mosaic authority. What's going on here? Well, the answer is here in the Hebrew. And if you can read this old Hebrew script, and you already know the answer. This is what it looks like transcribed into modern Hebrew print. And what Yeshua says there in Hebrew Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 to 3, Yeshua says, Al kisei Moshe Yeshua pirushim v'chachamim, v'ata כל אשר יאמר לכם שמרו ועשו, ובתקנותיהם ומעשיהם אל תעשו, שהם אומרים והם אינם עושים. So there you have it. There you see. It's very clear. This is what it would look like translated into English. There Yeshua says, the Pharisees and sages sit upon the seat of Moses, therefore all that he says to you, diligently do. But according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do, because they talk, but they do not do. Now that's a very subtle difference between what you saw in the Greek, a difference of one single word, or primarily one single word. In the Greek, it had said in Matthew, all that they say, you must obey all that they say, they being the Pharisees. In the Hebrew, he says you must obey all that he says, he being Moses. So the difference of this one single word fundamentally changes Yeshua's message. What he's saying now is, obey. If their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do as Moses says. Obey Moses. They claim their authority as they're sitting in this ornate stone chair in the synagogue, they're teaching with supposed authority, sitting in the seat of Moses, so obey Moses. Do what Moses says. Now, how did this happen? How do we change from they say to he says? Well, this is what it looks like in Hebrew, in the Hebrew manuscripts. And you can see it's very similar. It's almost identical. The difference between he says and they say is the difference of one single letter, the Hebrew letter Vav. This one single letter, the addition of this one single letter changed Yeshua's original message, which was an instruction to his disciples to obey Moses, to an instruction to his disciples to obey the Pharisees. So it changed his message from something that made perfect sense, their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do what Moses says, to this message which contradicts his own words in Matthew 15, which is obey the Pharisees. He goes on there, Yeshua, in Hebrew Matthew, and he says, according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do. And the word I've translated here as reforms in Hebrew is takanot. We've heard that word before, so let's all repeat that word. Takanot. So takanot are these man-made laws like the washing of the hands, and Yeshua's warning his disciples not to do according to their takanot. And I translated this before as enactments. A more precise dictionary definition of takanot is reforms that change biblical law. That's how the word is defined more precisely in the Jastrow Dictionary, which is a standard dictionary of early rabbinical Hebrew, late Second Temple Hebrew. Reforms that change biblical law. And the classic example of one of these man-made laws, these takanot, is the commandment to wash your hands of the rabbis before you eat bread. Well, now that we understand Matthew 23, and we see that Yeshua is not telling you to obey the Pharisees, he's telling you to obey Moses, we still have to go back at Matthew 15 and see what it says there in the Hebrew. If we started off with what was a contradiction in the Greek, we can't just look at the Hebrew of one passage and not the other. So now let's look at Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, and there we read, why do you also, Yeshua says to the Pharisees, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? You made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Can anyone guess what the Hebrew word behind tradition is? The word is takanot. So not only is there no contradiction in the Hebrew between Matthew 15 and Matthew 23, but in the Hebrew there's a consistent message throughout the entire book. There's this consistent string that runs through the book that Yeshua is warning his disciples not to follow the takanot of the Pharisees, these man-made laws of the Pharisees. If we go on in Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, we read in verse 9, remember how in the Greek it said teaching for doctrines the commandments of men? And I mentioned that was a paraphrase of Isaiah 29:13, which says learn commandments of men. Others translate this, learn commandments of men learned by rote. In the Hebrew Matthew, there's the exact quote from Isaiah word for word. Learn commandments of men. Now that's very interesting. If Hebrew Matthew is supposedly this translation from Greek, wouldn't it have the Hebrew equivalent of teaching for doctrine of the commandments of men rather than the exact precise words of Isaiah? That's a very, very interesting. Yeshua goes on. He warns against the takanot of the Pharisees. He also warns against their precedents, not to do their precedents. And the Hebrew word for precedents is ma'asim,